Hi, Mario the Spirit Scholar here, and today we're talking about distilling the truth. And that's AKA the lies behind the label. I want to show you a few terms that are on your average spirit bottle, and hopefully you can get a better understanding of what that means now. Sometimes brands will put some misleading information hoping that the consumer buys it because that's their job. They're there to sell the alcohol. Now, you can drink whatever you like. Like I always say, love what you drink and drink what you love. But you need to understand what these terms mean, and hopefully that can give you a better appreciation of alcohol. Protected terms. Who gets to decide what's on that label? Well, today we're going to talk about the US government and the things that they allow on their label, which are absolutely truthful, and which the American government will hammer down on top of brands if they don't follow these things to a T. So let's take a look. Bottled in bond. I know you've most likely seen it on a whiskey label, and that's how it started. Back in 1897, a lot of bad people were making bad whiskey, so the US government stepped in and it was looking to protect its citizens. But what does it mean? Well, it means that it has to be aged for 4 years, have to be 50% alcohol or 100 proof, has to be made by a single distiller, and it has to be produced either from the beginning of January to the end of June or the beginning of July to the end of December. But luckily, laws like this were the first of many that were protecting you, the US citizen. Proof is always going to be double the alcohol percentage. So if something is 80 proof, it's 40% alcohol. That is going to be guaranteed by the American government. Distilleries are putting a lot on the line if that alcohol percentage isn't right, if it's too much or too little. So that's one of the things that's going to be a guarantee for you. You always see an age statement on the label of a product. So in the US, if you have a whiskey that's less than 4 years old, it needs an age statement, whether it's years or months. If you have a brandy that's made in the US that's less than 2 years, it needs an age statement as well. Once you hit 4 years on a whiskey, the age statement is an option. So if it doesn't list it, it most likely is an option. If it doesn't list it and it's less than 4 years, they're risking putting themselves in trouble. And we talk about age statement, that's going to be the youngest spirit in there. So whether you have a 20-year-old whiskey and there's 1 drop of 5-year-old whiskey in there, that's 5-year-old whiskey, whether anybody likes it or not. So when bourbon or straight is listed on your label, there is a certain guarantee there. In bourbon, you're only allowed to be 51% corn, aged in new charred oak barrels, and made in the US. And a straight whiskey is either a bourbon, a rye, a malt whiskey that has been aged in a barrel for 2 years. These products are only allowed to have water added to them. So if it's bourbon or straight bourbon, and only straight rye or straight malt or other straight whiskeys can only have water added to them. But if you have a regular rye whiskey or a malt whiskey or etc., they're allowed to add up to 2.5% harmless flavoring and coloring, and they don't have to list it on the label. You know, all of these things are just small imperfections that they make adjustments to, but you know when you're getting a bourbon or a straight, that's going to be a guarantee. Gluten-free. Now, we know some big brands out there that rode on the back of the horse of gluten-free, and it made them really super popular. Unfortunately, in 2020, the US government and major celiac organizations recognized that distilled spirits are gluten-free. So whether you have a gluten intolerance or you have a celiac issue, you are totally safe to have any type of distilled spirit unless there's any type of adulteration that takes place post-production. But usually when you're talking about rum or whiskey or gin, you're pretty safe as far as gluten goes. But gluten doesn't really matter as much as it used to. State or country distilled in. This is listed on the label to show where it's actually made. Whether a product is made in Canada and then it gets aged and bottled in the US is definitely supposed to be on the label. And say you have a Kentucky bourbon, but your distillery is in Tennessee, it's supposed to list it on the label. Unfortunately, where the state it's distilled is one of the top things that don't get listed on a label, unfortunately. So now that I've told you to look for what state it's made in, you see Indiana. Well, in Indiana, there's a company called MGP. That's called Midwest Grain Products of Indiana. And their specialty? Making whiskey and products for other people. All they do is distill. They don't even actually release anything under their own label. But unfortunately, you can have somebody on the East Coast buy a spirit that they make that's also sold on the West Coast. There's no guarantees that you're not going to have the same product under a different name and a different price point. At the end of the day, unfortunately, it goes to marketing. But if you see Indiana on the label, there's a really good chance it's made by MGP. Distilled by, I'm talking about when you look on the back of a label and the brand you're buying from is also the brand listed as who distilled it. If it doesn't say distilled by, it might be made by somebody else. Non-protected terms. These are terms that you're going to see on the label that there is no government oversight for. They're going to get no slap on the wrist, no fine, no penalties for putting these things, even though they somewhat may be misleading to the consumer. And sometimes these brands just don't care. They just think it sounds good or it looks good. So these are things that are a bit of a more red flag for you. Small batch. What does that mean? I don't know. You don't know. The people who make it don't know, because small batch could be 2 barrels. Small batch could be 1,000 barrels. Small batch could be bigger than their average batches because there's no government oversight. You could say small batch and it could be any number of barrels. There's nothing there to protect you as a consumer. But you know what? Small batch sounds really cool. Handmade. This is like mom and pop shop stuff. Unfortunately, there's a lot of big brands that put handmade on their labels. And there's no regulation there. There's nothing to say that this is or is not handmade. And a judge had previously ruled that the average consumer cannot believe that a high manufactured product like a spirit could actually be handmade. And so if a bottle says handmade, you can't sue them, unfortunately. Old and rare. So you see old and rare on your label. It's really special. You're one of a kind. But what's it mean? Nothing. There's no age set for old. There's nothing set for rare, for how limited it is. So unfortunately, this one goes to the marketers. Craft. Well, if it's craft, it's definitely handmade, done lovingly, and definitely no big corporate bigwigs getting their hands in there. I wish it was true, but it's not. There are people who are pushing to designate craft as 750,000 gallons or less a year in production for a distillery. But you know what? The government doesn't say that. So you can say craft on anything you like. It doesn't mean anything. Non-chill filtered or chill filtered. You see this a lot on your labels. And it does mean something in the sense that chill filtration is supposed to make your product less cloudy. But the argument is when it's non-chill filtered, it's more flavorful, much better textures going on in there. But the regulation is not on it, so you're kind of taking the brand's word on it. They use non-chill filtered as kind of an advertising game. But also, if you're 46% alcohol, maybe 47% alcohol, you don't need to chill filter. You're not going to get a cloudy product anyway. So it's not a major feat for any brand that's 46% alcohol or more to say non-chill filtered on there. Cask strength or barrel proof. We are spending big money nowadays to get things like that because there's more juice in there. It's more selective. But you got to realize cask strength isn't a guarantee that it's only one cask. It could be a blend of several casks to make that cask strength. And also, we're taking their word on it. So they could have something that's cask strength or barrel proof, and they could add water to it to lengthen it out. But since the proof is pretty high, you said, well, they must be true. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. So I told you about looking at distilled by on the label. But now you see produced, aged, made by. None of these things say distilled. If it doesn't say distilled, that company did not make it. I'll repeat myself. If it doesn't say distilled by, that company did not make it. And they can use any type of language they want on there, but at the end of the day, they're getting that product from somebody else. And you may like that product. To each their own, absolutely. If it's good stuff, it's good stuff. Nothing's going to change that. But you should be made aware as a consumer. Historical fabrication. Now, I really wish it was true that we could find a whiskey today that George Washington troops were drinking and it was made exactly the same way. But between the Whiskey Rebellion, Prohibition, World War I, World War II, the fact that legislature for becoming bourbon didn't exist till 1964, also major brands exchange hands all the time and change recipes, and the fact that technology advances every couple of decades in distilling, it's showing you that this original family recipe from the 1700s is not going to be the same, and in reality is probably very undrinkable. So I hope you learned something a little bit about your spirit's label. There are things you can look out for now, and maybe they matter to you, and maybe they don't. These brands are here to make money. They want you to buy into the story or the imagery that they're providing, and that's fine. As long as you enjoy your brand, keep drinking it. But it's only fair that you should know what the government has oversight on, or what's just a gimmick at the end of the day. So hopefully now, being a wiser and smarter consumer, you can go out there and be a little bit more discriminatory about what you buy. So as always, drink what you love and love what you drink.